everybody. My name is Vivek Maru. I'm here with one of my heroes, Hina Jilani, who's a longtime human rights lawyer from Pakistan. She's been practicing human rights law for over 40 years, and among other things, she ran something called founded and ran something called the AGHS legal cell. She was UN Special Rapporteur for human rights defenders, and she's a member of the Elders, which is this little crew of superheroes, basically, that was founded by Nelson Mandela. And they are about to announce a new thematic priority on access to justice. And they have committed over the next several years to help us build a new global norm around the importance of access to justice. And Hina has come to, we're sitting in The Hague in the Netherlands, and Hina and I have both come here, she from her hometown Lahore in Pakistan, for a couple of reasons. There's a meeting of this Justice Task Force that we both sit on, and there's something called the Innovating Justice Forum. And so I'm thrilled to get some time with her, and just wanted to chat with you, Hina, a little bit about this issue that the elders are now committing to. One question I wanted to ask, I mean, we have some data that suggests that killings and abuse and crackdowns against justice defenders are actually on the rise. And I wanted to just ask you, why is protection of justice defenders important? And practically speaking, what can be done to improve protection?
I think it's a very obvious situation that we are contending with right now. Justice defenders are those who are asking basically and fundamentally for transparency and accountability of governments. We also keep saying this, but we don't understand the reality and the importance of what we are saying, that access to justice, it underlies all efforts that the global community is making towards achieving peace, achieving more tolerant and open societies. So this is a kind of a thread that runs through all these efforts. Now, the justice defenders are those who are asking for collective justice for those who are more marginalized and vulnerable. This collective justice is necessary in order to relieve people of the influence of certain entrenched interests. So there is, on the one side, collective justice, and on the other, there is a collective interest in preventing that collective justice. So obviously, they are trying to transform social power and control relationships. Those who are the entrenched interests couldn't reach that level of impact and influence if states and governments were not behind them, or there were some common interests that they shared. And you've seen that. You and I come from Asia. We understand how this is playing out. So national policies, national legislations, the frameworks under which business and human rights subjects are treated, these are all things that we worry about. And this is what the justice defenders are trying to do. So they are up against a very challenging task. Governments don't like them because the power relationship that they seek to change works for certain kinds of governments. But they must also realize now, I think, that at the level of the state, these power relationships are not allowing the global community to reach the target of peace, of tolerance and open societies. It is in fact the biggest hurdle towards achieving that end. So in a way, I think this whole SDG 16.3 has come at a time in history where governments will have to make some progress towards lessening the tension between different competing interests and make sure that some kind of a people-focused policy emerges. Justice defenders have to be protected because what they are trying to do is empower the people.
Thank you so much, Hina. To the extent that governments accept that fundamental principle that you are suggesting, what are some of the most valuable measures that they can take to advance protection in particular, to make sure that justice defenders don't face retaliation or threats?
I think to expect governments to take measures to protect defenders is an expectation that may not necessarily be fulfilled unless and until institutional systems and processes are built and restructured in a manner in which protection is inbuilt and inherent in those systems. I will not say today that there are governments all over the world who want to target those who want to bring about changes, but I will also say that there are sufficient number of governments who deviate from their obligation to protect, especially when they are confronted with a situation where civil society actors and human rights defenders in particularly take up that challenge seriously.
Yeah.
So I do believe that some of the systems and institutions need to become more sensitive to the needs of these human rights defenders.
Yeah. Is there an example of reforms that you've seen that have
let's
worked?
say the justice sector will very much benefit from judges understanding their role in protecting human rights defenders and justice sector activists from being criminalized. And a lot of activity that they undertake is criminalized. Secondly, I think governments have to understand that laws have to become more people sensitive and more empowering than they are at the moment. Because there are, if we talk about the rule of law, in some societies that sounds very hollow because the law has become an instrument of repression.
Repression, yeah.
So there is that kind of less credibility in that slogan. But so the reformation of laws is important.
Yeah.
A law reform will where you bring about changes in archaic laws. For instance, in my country, there is still a penal liability for the homeless. So you criminalize poverty in many ways, but this is just one example that I'm giving you.
Right.
So when I talk about more vulnerable communities like women, like children, minority communities, whether they're religious or ethnic minorities, we have to understand that the law itself needs to be empowered before you empower those people and give them the access to the law itself,
right,
and the protection of the law.
Right. It's not as if the law that we're raising awareness of is always perfect. To the contrary, there's oftentimes a big gap between the law on the books now and what we would think of as justice.
Absolutely, because you can't keep saying access to justice. What does it becomes meaningless if the access is to unjust laws,
right,
and where the protection of the law or the opportunity that the law gives to people is absent from the law itself.
And Hina, you have, when you talk about vulnerable people, it is not an abstraction to you. You have been at the coalface of this work, working directly with vulnerable people for many, many years. I was just curious, are there personal or practical lessons that you have taken away from that experience at the coalface of working people to protect their rights?
Yes, of course, there are many experiences, and these experiences are diverse because it really depends on which kind of community you were trying to help. But one of the lessons that I've learned is that human rights defenders or justice sector workers like myself, lawyers, we should be fully informed of the challenges and also the dangers and the risks that we take in undertaking this kind of work. Sometimes we think, it's a very technical thing. It's not. In many ways, in many parts of the world, we are challenging state-created security imperatives when we are helping the poor and the more vulnerable. So we don't realize that when we look at it on the paper. But when you start working on these issues, for instance, if I'm working on bonded labor, somewhere these interest groups will emerge that are linked to powerful forces that determine the security imperatives in your countries. So that kind of raises the level of risk that you take. It not only raises the level of risk to those who are taking these cases, but it also diminishes the ability and the will of institutions to deliver justice, because they don't want to face up to those big challenges and to confront those powerful forces that are resisting that change. For instance, I've seen judges back off. I have seen ombudsman's institutions hesitate to question and to hold accountable such powerful elements.
Right.
Whether they are within the state or in business sector or other powerful landlords, for instance, in our context.
Yeah, I appreciate you calling those out. I do think that behind the injustices that people face, there are often such powerful vested interests. And part of what I think the magic of the elders is the ability and the sort of the moral authority to call out those vested interests and to challenge them. Is there a case or a struggle or a campaign from 40 years running the AGHS legal cell that stands out in your mind that you might want to share? A story?
I think two things that I think are important to understand. One is, of course, this modern day slavery and the definition fitting the kind of bonded labor we have in the agricultural sector and in certain kinds of industry. So I think that's one.
We were supposed to have gotten rid of slavery a long time ago.
My constitution, for instance, says slavery is non-existent.
Yeah.
Which means they're closing their eyes to certain practices that amount to modern day slavery. But of course, there are successes. We were able to bring in laws that effectively did curtail some of the practices, or at least helped the victims to organize themselves in a manner in which they were able to avoid repression themselves. But the other issue is, of course, the whole question of women and how we progressed from a very conservative, closed thinking on women to where the law opened the way. And here I think, while I do understand what people say, that the law is not the only thing that brings social change, but it's a starting point. On honor killings, for instance, in my country and in large parts of South Asian countries, we have a long way to go, obviously, but I think that we have achieved a lot. And I think the major issue is that the law and legal battles in many ways strengthened and fed the women's movement and made it much more relevant to women's everyday problems. So there is this very effective women's rights movement in my country and many other countries, but it's moved out of the national context and gone to the regional and the international. And I think litigating on women's rights helped strengthen and give credibility to this movement.
That is such an important dynamic that we see in a lot of places, is the dialectic or the relationship between legal efforts and social movements. And you mentioned women's rights. One of the things that the Elders has done has chosen to put a spotlight on the rights of women and violence against women in particular. Why is that?
I think that this is one area of social justice that we see in an isolation. The Elders don't see it in an isolation. We think that, if we want to promote human rights, if we want to promote peace, and in fact, if we want to promote and encourage institutions to become more democratic, women's rights issues are very central to that. So it's not just women's equality that matters only to women. It is equality in itself that matters to building a progressive society and a more just and fair state. So I think this is what the Elders want. It's not just because we think it benefits women, but it benefits society on the whole, that this gap has to be filled up.
I think that's a strong note to close on, Hina. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us and for showing how and explaining how this core question of access to justice cuts through just about everything we care about. It's a thread, as you said, that runs through everything we care about. And we are so thrilled, we being the global community of folks dedicated to legal empowerment. We are so thrilled to have you and have the elders as partners in this, and look forward to working with you in the years to come, and sincere, heartfelt thanks for your courage and your advocacy.
Thank you, Vivek. You know, I am a part of the civil society.
Absolutely.
And that's how I always think of myself, as a human rights defender, more than just a lawyer. And I think that the elders, most of them have also a background there where they have been part of the civil society at one point or the other. So understand how important it is for this link to be strengthened all the time between global leadership and the civil society actors.
Awesome. So from one justice defender to many other justice defenders around the world. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hina.
Thank you.